In 1945, thousands lined frozen lakes to watch iceboat racers hit 140 mph. By 1975, every fleet vanished. What killed America's fastest winter sport? In the winter of 1945, thousands of spectators crowded the frozen surface of Lake Mendota near Madison, Wisconsin to watch iceboat racers reach speeds of 140 miles per hour, faster than contemporary land speed records. These weren't fringe events. Between 1945 and 1965, organized iceboat racing was a legitimate winter sport, with sanctioned fleets operating on frozen lakes across the northern United States and Canada, Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, Seneca Lake in New York, the lakes of Minnesota, Michigan, and Ontario. The International Iceboat Class Association, founded in 1938, standardized boat design and competitive rules. Races drew crowds in the thousands. The boats themselves were engineering marvels, sharp-hulled craft with canvas sails, mounted on steel runners, capable of speeds that defied the frozen lake's apparent limits. Competitors were often local heroes. Entry fees were modest. The season was short but intense, December through February, when conditions froze solid and wind was reliable. Spectators bundled against the cold, children perched on parents' shoulders, entire towns treating race day like a holiday. Local newspapers ran front-page previews. But the texture of iceboat life extended beyond race days. There were maintenance sheds where sailors meticulously tuned their craft. There were informal training runs on quiet mornings. There were winter social clubs built around the sport families who returned to the same frozen lakes year after year, accumulating decades of shared memory on ice. Equipment dealers in Wisconsin and upstate New York depended on seasonal sales. Regional champion sailors became minor celebrities in their communities, their names appearing in sports sections alongside baseball and football. By 1975, nearly all of it was gone. No organized fleets, no sanctioned races, no crowds. The boats were abandoned, sold for scrap, or left to rot in barns. The sudden collapse was so complete that most Americans forgot the sport had ever existed at all. What no one realized in 1945 was that a crucial environmental shift, one affecting the reliability of winter itself, had already begun. By 1950, the ice itself had become unreliable. Racing fleets that had operated continuously since the 1880s, the Skenetal's Lake Ice Yacht Club in New York, the Saint fleets, that means Clare Flats Association near Detroit, the Mendota Ice Yacht Club in Wisconsin, began reporting shorter seasons and thinner ice. What had been predictable winter became a gamble. Track officials started moving races earlier each season, sometimes weeks earlier than their grandfathers had. The boat builders didn't adjust. The spectators didn't know why. An average winter in 1920 froze lakes solid by December. By 1955, many didn't freeze completely until January, if at all. Race committees kept hoping. They kept printing schedules. In 1962, the Wisconsin State Journal reported that 3 major regattas were cancelled in a single winter. The newspaper treated it as weather. Nobody connected the dots to see a pattern. Nobody asked whether the pattern would continue. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the cities. Suburbs were spreading. Highways were paving over the rural approach roads to frozen lakes. The working people who had spent frozen weekends watching iceboat races, farmers, factory workers, railroad men were moving to developments 40 miles away. Their children weren't learning to sail on ice. They were learning to drive cars on asphalt. By 1960, attendance at races that still happened had dropped by nearly 60% from 1940 levels, according to surviving race records from Skenetal's. The boat builders saw it coming. Some tried to adapt shorter seasons, smaller fleets, corporate sponsorship from manufacturers trying to stay relevant. But They were betting on a winter that was already leaving. And one competitor in particular, a Detroit-based racer named Art Michaelak, would make a decision in 1964 that historians now suspect accelerated the collapse of the entire sport. In 1945, iceboat racing was still America's winter pastime. By 1975, it had simply ceased to exist as a commercial sport. The vanishing wasn't sudden, it was systematic, almost invisible as it happened. Start with 1945. The DN-class iceboats dominated frozen lakes from Wisconsin to upstate New York. Thousands of spectators lined the shores of Lake Mendota in Madison, Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, and Skenado's Lake in New York for weekend races. Prize purses ran into the thousands. Newspapers sent sports reporters. Then, subtly, the crowds began to thin. By 1955, the Wisconsin Ice Yacht Racing Association, once the sport's epicenter, reported declining participation. The Indianapolis 500 had captured national attention. Television was rewiring American leisure. Families chose to stay indoors. The marginal economics of maintaining frozen courses, ensuring races, and paying officials suddenly looked precarious to lake associations. The real rupture came between 1960 and 1965. One by one, the signature race meets disappeared. Lake Geneva's championship, a fixture since the 1890s, was downsized to regional status. The National Iceboat Championships, once drawing competitors from close states, relocated constantly, searching for adequate ice and spectator interest. By 1968, even dedicated racers like those competing at Skenado's admitted the sport was dying. Weather accelerated the collapse. The winters of 1972 and 1973 were particularly mild across the Northeast and Midwest. Frozen racing surfaces became unreliable. Insurance premiums climbed as sponsorship evaporated. The final commercial iceboat races, documented but barely covered in local papers, occurred in the early 1970s. No one organized a farewell. No one declared it finished. By 1975, the infrastructure was gone. The boats themselves survived in private collections and museums. The courses remained as geographic locations. But the knowledge of how to organize a race, the community that had sustained it for a century, the economic ecosystem supporting competitors and spectators, all of it had simply dissolved into the winter silence. What nobody anticipated was that the boats themselves would develop an almost occult reputation among those who later discovered them. By 1960, the absence had become impossible to ignore. Ice racing had employed thousands: boat builders, course marshals, pit crews, even dedicated newspaper correspondents. The Milwaukee Sentinel alone had run weekly coverage. Now, the infrastructure simply evaporated. Manufacturers like the Scootercraft Company of Michigan stopped taking orders. Sponsorships dried up. Lake Mendota near Madison, Wisconsin, which had hosted the Nationals since 1937, fell silent. The hole was real and measurable. Racing clubs across the upper Midwest folded between 1955 and 1965. The International Iceboat Class Association, founded in 1927, struggled to maintain membership. What had drawn 8,000 spectators to a single race weekend in 1948 now barely filled a parking lot. Historians still debate the causes. Some cite the interstate highway system, which redirected leisure time and travel patterns. Others point to climate change. Winters were becoming less predictable, ice less reliable. A handful of old racers, interviewed in the 1970s, simply shrugged. The world moved on, one told the Storr County Advocate in 1974. But for those still paying attention, something stranger had taken root. Derelict iceboats sat in barns and backyards across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. Locals began reporting them as uncanny, not merely forgotten but wrong somehow. A farmer near Oshkosh described his inherited boat as sitting heavier each year. Another claimed his grandfather's racer had developed a scorch mark on its hull that wasn't there before. The Green Bay Press-Gazette dismissed these accounts as nostalgia or rot, yet the stories accumulated. By the early 1970s, amateur collectors and salvage enthusiasts began actively seeking these vessels, not to restore them to racing condition, but to study them. What they found inside some of those boats suggested that the racing community's disappearance might have been stranger and far more deliberate than anyone suspected. What remains of commercial Iceboat racing today fits in a handful of museums and private collections. The Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc holds 3 intact racing hulls from the 1930s and 1950s. The Smithsonian Institution's Archives Center received a partial donation of race records from the International Iceboat Class Association in 1982, though archivists note that roughly 70% of the organization's pre-1960 documentation was never located. And that's nearly everything. Historians have reconstructed the basic timeline. Participation peaked around 1949, when the Milwaukee Ice Yacht Club alone drew 4,000 spectators to a single Saturday race. By 1965, that same venue averaged fewer than 300. The shift wasn't gradual. It compressed into 5 winters. Between 1962 and 1967, 17 active racing clubs in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota simply ceased operations. No announcements, no final races. Some dissolved their charters without scheduling closing events. What we've learned cuts 2 ways. The warming trend was real. Lake freezing seasons did shorten after 1948, documented by NOAA temperature records. But climate alone doesn't explain the uniformity of the collapse or the speed. Sociologists point to suburban sprawl and the rise of recreational skiing as competing winter attractions. Insurance costs for sanctioned events tripled between 1955 and 1970. And yet, in 2003, researchers examining archived equipment at the Class Association's relocated headquarters in Madison discovered something unexpected: handwritten ledgers showing that major sponsors, primarily industrial ice harvesting companies, had collectively withdrawn funding in early 1962. The withdrawal appeared coordinated. No correspondence explaining why survives in any archive we can access. Only the decision itself remains documented. It raises a question nobody has adequately answered. Was iceboat racing abandoned by its community, or was it strategically dismantled by the commercial interests that sustained it? A sport that once commanded the frozen heart of North America simply sailed away into memory. Another file is already open: the ghost fleets of Midwest speedways. If forgotten history fascinates you, subscribe to the archive.